The killer who walked into homes at night. Think about tonight. When you go to sleep, you'll probably check that the front door is locked. Maybe the back door too. Maybe you'll glance at the windows on the ground floor. And then you'll go to bed and not think about it again. That habit, that small, automatic check before sleep, exists in millions of homes across California because of one person. One person who, across 14 months in 1984 and 1985, made an entire metropolitan area of 12 million people afraid to close their eyes. His name was Richard Ramirez. And the reason he was so terrifying, the reason the fear he generated was different from almost any other criminal case before or since, was not just what he did. It was the randomness. There was no profile, no neighborhood, no type. He could be outside anyone's window tonight, and nobody knew which window. Richard Leyva Munoz Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, the youngest of 5 in a working-class Mexican-American family. His father, Julian, was a former Mexican police officer who worked on the railroad. The household was strict, sometimes physically harsh, but not extraordinary. What was extraordinary was his relationship with his cousin Miguel. Miguel Ramirez was a Vietnam veteran who came back changed in ways that, in the early 1970s, were not being adequately identified or treated. He was violent, erratic, deeply disturbed, and he was Richard's idol. Richard spent enormous amounts of time with Miguel as a child and young teenager. Miguel showed him photographs from Vietnam, not of combat in any general sense. Photographs Miguel had taken himself, of women he claimed to have assaulted and killed during his service. Richard was around 10 years old the first time he saw them. What Richard Ramirez absorbed in those years, from a man he admired, who treated violence as something to be documented, who framed brutality as power, was being laid down in a developing mind before he had any framework to process it. In 1973, when Richard was 13, Miguel shot his wife in the face in front of him during an argument. Miguel was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Richard never fully processed what he witnessed. He started having seizures, likely from untreated childhood epilepsy, which affected his schooling and social development. He began using drugs heavily, dropped out, started drifting. By his early 20s, he had moved to California, first San Francisco, then Los Angeles. Cheap motels in Skid Row. No job, no structure, sustained by petty theft and drug use. Something had been building inside him since he was 10 years old, sitting in a room with his cousin, looking at photographs. Yeah, that foundation was going to matter. The attacks began in 1984. The first confirmed victim was Jenny Vincao, a 79-year-old woman in Glassell Park, Los Angeles. Ramirez entered through an open window while she slept. He killed her. The violence was disproportionate to any practical purpose. This was not a robbery that escalated. This was intentional. And then the attacks started accelerating. In the spring and summer of 1985, Ramirez operated at a pace and with a geographic range that made any pattern nearly impossible to establish in real time. Rosemead, Monterey Park, Whittier, San Gabriel, Arcadia, Sun Valley. He drove between locations, stolen vehicles, which meant the attacks weren't clustered in a way that would make them obviously the work of one person. This is no longer a cold case. This is a city that is starting to understand it has a problem it doesn't have a name for yet. The victims were staggering in their variety. A 34-year-old woman, a 6-year-old girl, couples in their 60s, a teenager, an 84-year-old man. Different ages, ethnicities, neighborhoods spread across an enormous metropolitan area. Men and women. Some killed, some attacked and survived. The only consistent elements were the entry method, windows, sliding glass doors, unlocked entries, the small vulnerabilities that exist in almost any home, and the timing. Always at night. Always while people were sleeping. By the summer of 1985, the media had the story at full volume. The term, Night Stalker, had entered the public conversation. What happened to Los Angeles in those months is now studied as a case study in mass fear response. Hardware stores sold out of window locks and door bolts. Home security companies couldn't meet demand. Gun sales increased. Neighborhood watch programs reformed overnight. People who had lived in the same house for 20 years started sleeping with weapons within reach. The fear was not irrational. It was a completely reasonable response to a genuine, documented, active threat that investigators had not yet been able to stop. But the nature of that fear, the way it spread, the way it affected behavior far beyond any statistical likelihood of being a target, was specific to the randomness. If Ramirez had targeted only elderly women, or only a specific neighborhood, everyone outside that profile could have told themselves they were safe. The randomness eliminated that comfort entirely. Every person in Los Angeles was, statistically, a potential victim. And every person in Los Angeles knew it. The investigation was massive and, for months, frustratingly slow. Multiple agencies involved, LAPD, the LA County Sheriff's Department, jurisdictions in San Francisco after attacks that were linked. They had fingerprints from some scenes, shoe prints, witness descriptions. But in the pre-digital era, cross-referencing evidence across jurisdictions was slow and imprecise. The break came in August 1985. A partial fingerprint from one crime scene was entered into California's newly implemented computerized fingerprint identification system, one of the first times this technology was used in a major investigation. The system returned a match. Richard Ramirez. Prior arrests for auto theft. On file. On August 30th, newspapers across Los Angeles ran his photograph on their front pages. His name. His face. The words, "This is the Night Stalker." By this point, there is no quiet exit from this story for Richard Ramirez. Because 12 million people had just seen his face. What happened the following day is one of the most extraordinary moments in American criminal justice history. Ramirez, apparently unaware his photograph had been published, he had been in Phoenix, returned to Los Angeles by bus on the morning of August 31st. He walked into a convenience store in East Los Angeles. He saw a newspaper rack. He saw his own face on every front page. He ran. He attempted to steal a car in the Hubbard Street neighborhood. The owner, Faustino Pinion, caught him and wrestled him to the ground. Ramirez broke free and ran again. He tried to steal a second car. A woman named Angela de la Torre was inside. Her husband, Manuel, chased him on foot. Neighbors heard the commotion and came out. More people joined the chase. The crowd grew. Ramirez ran for blocks with an increasing number of East LA residents pursuing him. He was eventually caught and beaten by the crowd. Jose Burgoyne and his two sons, Jamie and John, were among those who physically subdued him and held until police arrived. The Night Stalker. The man who had paralyzed an entire city for 14 months. Caught not by a tactical police unit. Not by a sophisticated investigative operation. By the neighborhood he tried to escape through. Yeah, that ending is the one that stays with you. His trial was one of the longest and most expensive in California history, 1988 through 1989, delayed repeatedly by procedural motions and Ramirez's own disruptive behavior in court. He was charged with 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. During trial, he made no attempt to project innocence or remorse. He raised his hand to show a pentagram drawn on his palm. He shouted, "Hail Satan," at reporters after his conviction. Convicted on all 63 counts. September 20th, 1989. The jury sentenced him to death. He spent the next 23 years on death row at San Quentin. He received fan mail, marriage proposals. A woman named Doreen Leoe, who had written him approximately 75 letters, married him in prison in 1996. Richard Ramirez died on June 7, 2013, from complications related to B-cell lymphoma. Age 53. His death row sentence was never carried out. Here's what this case actually reveals. The randomness wasn't just a feature of Ramirez's psychology, it was a feature of his method. Most serial offenders follow identifiable patterns that eventually allow investigators to predict behavior. Ramirez broke every one of them. Different neighborhoods, victim profiles, weapons, levels of violence. That unpredictability was, functionally, a tactical advantage, and it exposed a gap in how investigations were structured at the time. The fingerprint matching system that identified him, AFIS, the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, was in its operational infancy in 1985. The Ramirez case became one of its first high-profile demonstrations and directly accelerated its adoption nationwide. Every cold case solved by fingerprint matching since then owes something to the infrastructure investment cases like this one forced. And the citizen capture became a reference point in discussions about community-based public safety that continue today. Not as an argument for vigilantism, but as an illustration of what happens when an entire community is personally invested in resolving a threat. Those residents weren't acting out of abstract civic duty. They were scared. They recognized the face from the morning paper, and they decided this was not going to be someone else's problem. That decision ended 14 months of terror in about 40 minutes. Richard Ramirez entered through windows that were unlocked, doors that were slightly open, small vulnerabilities that exist in almost every home. The same vulnerabilities that exist in your home tonight. Not to scare you, but to ask a real question. The systems we rely on for safety, police, investigations, technology, are essential. But in that specific neighborhood, on that specific morning, it was just people. Paying attention, recognizing a threat, and deciding together that enough was enough. How much of the safety you feel right now depends on systems? And how much depends on the people around you actually knowing what's happening? Leave it in the comments. Because I think that question matters more than most people realize.